In the vast darkness of space, where civilizations measure their worth by surviving impossible trials, humanity was considered the weakest link. When the Galactic Council selected representatives for the legendary Frozen Hell trial, a test so brutal that entire species had gone extinct attempting it, they chose humans not for their strength, but as a cruel joke. After all, what could a species that hadn't even mastered interstellar travel offer against beings who could manipulate matter with their minds, creatures who had evolved in the vacuum of space, and entities older than most stars? But the Council had made one critical error in their calculations. They had confused human weakness with human ingenuity. They had mistaken our short lifespan for fragility, our small stature for insignificance, and our emotional nature for instability. They were about to learn why the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't the strongest predator, the most advanced technology, or even the harshest environment. It's a human who refuses to give up. Welcome to the trial that would redefine what it means to be strong. Welcome to the moment humanity stopped being the galaxy's underdog and became its most feared survivors. The temperature is dropping. The aliens are dying. But the humans are just getting started. The transport ship Convergence hummed through the void toward Crystal 9, a planet that existed at the edge of known space where temperatures could drop to absolute zero within hours. Captain Sarah Chen pressed her face against the reinforced viewport, watching the ice-blue sphere grow larger. Behind her, the other representatives of various galactic species prepared for what many considered a death sentence disguised as an honor. The Galactic Council had established the Frozen Hell trial 3 centuries ago as the ultimate test of species worthiness. Every 50 years, they selected representatives from different worlds to compete in this brutal survival challenge. The rules were simple: survive 30 days on Crystal 9 with minimal supplies. The reality was far more complex. Of the 47 species that had attempted the trial, only 12 had succeeded, and most had lost multiple representatives in the process. Humanity had never been invited before. They were too new, too primitive, too weak. But recent events had changed everything. When human explorers had successfully rescued survivors from a Zephyrian colony ship that had been given up for lost in a nebula for 6 months, the Council had taken notice. When those same humans had somehow survived in that nebula without proper environmental suits for 3 weeks, eating emergency rations meant to last 3 days, the Council had been intrigued. When the rescue team had not only saved the Zephyrians but had also somehow repaired their ship using spare parts and sheer creativity, the Council had decided it was time to test these strange creatures properly. Now Sarah Chen found herself representing all of humanity alongside her teammate, Dr. Marcus Webb, a former Antarctic researcher whose specialty in extreme environment survival had made him the obvious choice. They were the youngest species ever to attempt the trial, and many of the other representatives made no effort to hide their disdain. The crystalline being that served as the transport captain materialized near Sarah's position. The Zerathians were made of living mineral formations and communicated through harmonic frequencies that the ship's translators converted to speech. Human Chen, it chimed. Your species designation continues to puzzle the collective. Your physical specifications suggest unsuitability for survival trials. Sarah turned from the viewport, her breath visible in the increasingly cold transport bay. The ship's environmental systems were already being adjusted to match Crystal 9's initial conditions. That's what makes this interesting, Captain. We might surprise you. A harsh, grating laugh echoed from across the bay. Thrak Vor, the representative of the Corvellian Empire, stood nearly 3 meters tall with scales that could deflect energy weapons and internal heating systems that had evolved over millions of years. Surprise us by dying first, perhaps. Your species lacks natural defenses, proper size, or any meaningful adaptation for extreme environments. And yet, here we are, Marcus said quietly, adjusting his equipment pack. Unlike the other species, the humans had brought what appeared to be primitive tools and materials rather than advanced technology. The Corvellians had energy field generators, the Zephyrians had matter manipulators, and the Silicon Collective had computing systems that could calculate optimal survival strategies in real time. The humans had bundles of fabric, metal containers, and objects that most other species couldn't even identify. As the transport approached Crystal 9's atmosphere, the temperature inside the bay dropped another 10 degrees. Sarah watched the other representatives with interest. The Corvellians seemed unaffected, their natural heating keeping them comfortable. The Zephyrians began to glow slightly as they activated their internal energy reserves. The Silicon Collective simply ran warmer processing cycles. The crystalline Zerathians actually seemed to become more vibrant as the temperature dropped. Marcus began removing items from his pack and handing them to Sarah. They moved with practiced efficiency, wrapping themselves in layers of what appeared to be primitive insulation. The other representatives watched with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. "Is that animal fur?" asked Lyrix, the Zephyrian representative. "Her species had evolved beyond the need for such crude materials millions of years ago. Synthetic, actually," Marcus replied, pulling on what looked like thick foot coverings, but designed based on animal fur principles: air trapping, moisture wicking, layered insulation. Techniques our species developed over thousands of years of surviving in hostile environments on our home world, Thrakvor snorted. "Primitive adaptation for a primitive species. Your world must be exceptionally harsh to require such crude survival methods." Sarah smiled as she secured her outer layer. "You could say that. Most of our planet's surface is uninhabitable at various times. We have regions where water freezes solid for months, deserts where the surface temperature exceeds most species' survival limits, and pressure environments that would crush vessels designed for normal atmospheric conditions." The crystalline captain's harmonic grew more complex, indicating surprise. "Your entire species evolved under such conditions?" "Not just evolved," Marcus said, checking his equipment one final time. "Thrived. We learned to survive everywhere. Ice, desert, mountains, deep ocean, underground. If there's an environment on our planet, humans have figured out how to live in it." The transport shuddered as it entered Crystal 9's atmosphere. Through the viewports, they could see the planet's surface, endless ice fields broken by crystalline formations and rocky outcroppings. The temperature readings on the wall displays began dropping rapidly. "Atmospheric entry complete," the captain announced. "Surface temperature, -47 standard units and dropping. Wind velocity, 63 standard units with gusts to 90. Atmospheric pressure, 0.7 standard. All representatives prepare for deployment." The deployment chamber was a stark metal room with individual pods designed to safely deliver each representative to the planet's surface. The pods were basic life support containers with minimal supplies, emergency rations for 3 days, water recycling units, and basic shelter materials. Everything else they had to provide themselves or find on the planet. As they sealed their pods, Sarah caught Marcus's eye through their transparent barriers. They had trained for this moment for 2 years, studying every available record of previous trials, learning from both successes and failures. They knew what the other species would do: rely on their natural advantages and advanced technology to simply endure the harsh conditions until rescue arrived 30 days later. But humans had a different approach to survival. They didn't just endure hostile environments, they changed them. The deployment sequence began with a mechanical whir that vibrated through the ship's hull. One by one, the pods were launched toward the planet's surface, each following a slightly different trajectory to ensure representatives were scattered across the test zone. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of atmospheric entry as her pod heated up despite the frigid environment outside. Through her pod's small viewport, she watched the alien landscape rushing up to meet her. Crystal 9 was beautiful in its hostility. Massive ice formations jutted from the ground like frozen cathedrals, and the constant wind carved intricate patterns in the snow that covered everything. It was the kind of beauty that could kill you if you stopped to admire it for too long. Her pod's impact was surprisingly gentle, designed to avoid injury that would compromise the trial's fairness. Sarah activated the emergency release and stepped out into an environment that immediately tried to kill her. The wind hit her like a physical blow, carrying ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. The ground beneath her feet was solid ice covered by a thin layer of snow that crunched with each step. Most species would have immediately sought shelter, would have activated their advanced systems and begun the process of simply enduring the next 30 days. But Sarah did something that had never been recorded in any previous trial. She began to survey the immediate area, not for shelter, but for resources. The emergency shelter from her pod was a simple atmospheric barrier designed to keep out wind and maintain basic pressure. It would keep her alive, barely, for perhaps a week before its power cells died. But Sarah ignored it completely. Instead, she began collecting materials from the immediate area. Ice chunks of different densities, small rocks that had been exposed by wind erosion, and even some of the metallic debris from her pod's disposable components. 200 meters away, Marcus was doing the same thing. His pod had landed near one of the crystalline formations, and he was carefully examining its structure and composition. To any observer, it would have looked like he was planning to take shelter in its shadow. They would have been wrong. The first day of any previous trial was typically spent by representatives establishing basic shelter and rationing supplies. The first week was usually spent very conservatively, trying to make emergency resources last as long as possible. The first month was an exercise in endurance, waiting for rescue while hoping their natural advantages and technology could keep them alive. Sarah and Marcus had a different plan entirely. As the sun began to set on Crystal 9, bringing with it temperatures that would drop below the survival threshold for most known species, Sarah had done something unprecedented in the trial's history. She had built a fire, not an energy field, or a heating unit, or a technological solution, but an actual fire, using techniques that her species had developed before they had even discovered electricity. The fire was small, carefully contained, and fueled by organic compounds she had synthesized from materials in her pack, combined with carbon-based debris from the pod. It provided heat, light, and something else that no previous trial participant had ever possessed on Crystal 9. The psychological comfort of pushing back against the hostile environment instead of simply enduring it. As the temperature continued to drop and the wind howled across the ice fields, Sarah fed her fire and began the next phase of her plan. She wasn't just trying to survive the trial. She was going to prove that humans belonged among the galactic community, not despite their apparent weaknesses, but because of how those weaknesses had forced them to become something far more dangerous than the strongest predator or the most advanced technology. They had become problem solvers. The Galactic Council had designed the Frozen Hell trial to test raw survival capability. They were about to learn the difference between surviving and thriving, between enduring an environment and making it work for you. They were about to discover why betting against human ingenuity was always a mistake. In the distance, Sarah could see the faint energy signatures of other representatives' emergency systems beginning to activate as the full reality of Crystal 9's hostility became apparent. Soon, they would be burning through power reserves, rationing supplies, and beginning the long, slow process of trying to outlast an environment that was designed to kill them. But Sarah Chen had no intention of simply outlasting anything. As she settled in for the night next to her fire, she was already planning the next day's project, a more permanent shelter, a water collection system, and if she was lucky, the beginning of a sustainable heat source that would carry her through all 30 days of the trial. Because that was what humans did. They didn't just survive impossible situations, they found ways to make impossible situations survivable. And sometimes, if they were very clever and very determined, they found ways to make impossible situations comfortable. The first day of the trial was ending, and Sarah Chen was not just alive, she was warm. Dawn on Crystal 9 arrived with a brightness that was almost painful to observe. The planet's twin suns reflected off the ice surface, creating a glare that could damage unprotected vision within minutes. Sarah woke to find that her fire had burned down to coals, but the shelter she had built around it had retained enough heat to keep her sleeping area above freezing. More importantly, she had slept comfortably while the temperature outside had dropped to -73 standard units. The morning routine that followed would have seemed impossible to any observer familiar with previous trials. Instead of rationing emergency supplies and hoping to conserve energy, Sarah began what could only be described as construction work. Using techniques that humans had developed in polar environments on Earth, she began building a more permanent shelter. The process started with understanding the environment itself. Most species saw Crystal 9 as a hostile wasteland, but Sarah saw it as a collection of resources waiting to be properly utilized. The ice wasn't just frozen water. Different formations had different densities and structural properties. The wind wasn't just a threat, it was a potential energy source and a tool for shaping materials. Even the extreme cold wasn't just an obstacle, it was a preservation method and a way to make certain materials more workable. Marcus, meanwhile, had made a discovery that would change everything. The crystalline formations that dotted the landscape weren't just geological structures, they were partially organic, created by microscopic life forms that had adapted to survive in the planet's extreme conditions. These organisms generated small amounts of heat through their metabolic processes, and Marcus had figured out how to concentrate and amplify that heat using principles of thermodynamics that his species had mastered centuries before achieving spaceflight. By midday, Sarah had completed the frame of a shelter that was larger than the emergency pod she had started with, and infinitely more sophisticated. Using a combination of ice blocks cut to specific shapes and angles, debris from her landing pod, and insulation materials from her pack, she had created a structure that not only protected against the wind but actually captured and redirected it to help ventilate her living space while maintaining heat retention. The construction process itself was remarkable to observe. Sarah worked with her hands, using simple tools to shape and position materials with a precision that matched what most species could achieve with matter manipulators. But more than that, she worked with an understanding of physics and engineering that was intuitive rather than calculated. Every decision she made seemed to flow naturally from years of accumulated knowledge about how materials behaved under different conditions. What she was building wasn't just shelter, it was the foundation of a sustainable living environment. The floor was elevated to prevent heat loss to the ground and designed with channels that would collect and direct meltwater. The walls were double-layered, with air gaps for insulation and positioned to maximize solar heat gain during the brief daylight hours while providing protection from the constant wind. The roof was angled to shed snow, but strong enough to bear the weight of the ice that would inevitably accumulate. Most remarkably, Sarah had incorporated her fire into the design not as a simple heat source, but as the center of an integrated heating and cooking system. Using principles that humans had developed in primitive conditions, she had created a system that burned fuel efficiently, minimized smoke, and distributed heat throughout the shelter while providing a surface for food preparation and water melting. As the second day progressed, Sarah began phase 2 of her survival strategy, resource acquisition. While other trial participants were carefully rationing their emergency supplies, Sarah was working to make those supplies irrelevant. She began by setting up water collection systems that would capture and purify moisture from the air and melt ice efficiently. Then she turned her attention to food production. The idea of producing food on Crystal 9 had never occurred to previous trial participants. The planet seemed completely barren, devoid of any life that could serve as nutrition. But Sarah had brought something that no other species had ever considered for the trial: seeds. Not just any seeds, but varieties that humans had specifically engineered for extreme cold environments. These plants had been developed for terraforming operations and Arctic research stations, designed to grow in minimal soil with limited light and extreme temperature variations. Sarah began preparing growing containers using materials from her pod and shelter construction, creating microenvironments that could sustain plant life even in Crystal 2.9's harsh conditions. The process required improvisation on a level that bordered on artistry. Sarah created soil using organic compounds from her pack, processed organic waste from her emergency rations, and even incorporated beneficial microorganisms that she had brought in specialized containers. She built growing boxes that captured maximum sunlight during the day and retained heat during the night, creating tiny oases of life in one of the most hostile environments known to galactic civilization. Meanwhile, Marcus was developing his own innovations. His background in polar research had given him expertise not just in surviving extreme cold, but in turning it into an advantage. He had begun creating what could only be described as a refrigeration and preservation system that used the natural environment to store food and water, while keeping them accessible and unfrozen when needed. But Marcus's most significant contribution was his work with the crystalline formations. Through careful study and experimentation, he had discovered that these structures could be modified to serve as natural heating elements. By introducing small amounts of organic material in specific patterns, he could encourage the microscopic organisms within the crystals to increase their metabolic activity, generating more heat. The result was a heating system that was sustainable, renewable, and completely adapted to the local environment. By the end of the second day, both humans had accomplished something that had never been achieved in previous trials. They had made Crystal 9 work for them instead of against them. Sarah's shelter was not only comfortable but was actually improving over time as her systems began to function more efficiently. Marcus's heating innovations were providing warmth that required no external power source and would only get better as the organic components matured. The third day brought the first crisis that separated this trial from all previous attempts. A massive storm system moved across the continent, bringing with it wind velocities that exceeded design tolerances for most emergency equipment, and temperatures that dropped below what most species could survive, even with their advanced technology. For the other trial participants, this storm represented a potentially catastrophic challenge. Emergency shelters were stressed beyond their limits, power systems strained to provide adequate heating, and several representatives began to consider activating emergency evacuation beacons. The Corvellian representative actually did activate his beacon, becoming the first elimination from the trial, when his internal heating system began to fail under the extreme conditions. But for Sarah and Marcus, the storm was an opportunity. Sarah's shelter was not only weathering the conditions, but was actually becoming more comfortable as the wind patterns she had designed for began to function exactly as intended. The storm brought with it moisture that her collection systems captured and ice that she could harvest for construction materials. Her fire, properly ventilated and fed with fuel she had prepared, burned steadily throughout the worst conditions. Marcus used the storm to test and refine his heating systems, discovering that the extreme cold actually made his crystalline heating elements more efficient. He also realized that the storm debris could provide additional materials for shelter improvement and tool construction. While other participants hunkered down to merely survive, Marcus ventured out into the storm to collect resources. The image of a human walking calmly through conditions that were forcing other species to consider evacuation was being recorded by monitoring satellites and transmitted throughout the galactic community. For the first time in the trial's history, representatives of a supposedly inferior species were not just surviving but actually improving their situation during the worst environmental challenge the planet could offer. The fourth day of the storm brought another revelation. Sarah's plants were growing in conditions that should have been utterly hostile to any form of life not specifically adapted to the planet. She had created sustainable food production. The growing containers maintained temperatures and humidity levels that allowed for photosynthesis and growth, powered by a combination of natural sunlight, reflected light from her shelter design, and heat from her integrated heating system. Marcus, meanwhile, had begun what could only be described as terraforming on a microscale. Using techniques that combined his knowledge of extremophile organisms with engineering principles, he was creating small areas around his shelter where the local environment was actually improving. His crystalline heating elements were creating warm zones that attracted and concentrated the planet's indigenous microscopic life, which in turn made the heating elements more efficient and created small ecosystems that could support larger life forms. By the end of the fourth day, both humans had accomplished something unprecedented in the trial's history. They had begun to change crystal 9 instead of simply enduring it. Sarah was producing food and living in comfort that exceeded what many species enjoyed in their standard habitats. Marcus was creating sustainable systems that were improving the environment around him, and both were doing this with technology that the Galactic Council considered primitive. The implications were staggering. Every previous trial had been a test of species' ability to survive hostile conditions using their natural advantages and advanced technology. The humans were demonstrating that there was an entirely different approach to survival, adaptation, innovation, and the systematic conversion of hostile environments into livable ones. As reports from Crystal 9 reached the Galactic Council, emergency sessions were called to discuss what was happening. The humans weren't just surviving the trial. They were redefining what survival meant. They were proving that strength wasn't about enduring impossible conditions, but about making impossible conditions possible. The trial was only 4 days old, and already everything the galactic community thought they knew about survival, adaptation, and environmental challenge was being questioned. Because the humans weren't playing by the rules that every other species had followed, they were changing the rules entirely. And they were just getting started. The first week of the trial ended with an unprecedented situation. For the first time in the trial's 3-century history, monitoring stations detected increasing levels of biological activity in areas where representatives were stationed. But this wasn't the expected decrease in life signs as participants struggled against the hostile environment. It was new life, growing and thriving in regions that had been completely barren for millennia. Sarah's agricultural project had exceeded every expectation. What had started as a few hardy seeds in improvised containers had become a small but functioning farm. Her plants were not only surviving but producing food at rates that would have been impressive in controlled greenhouse conditions. The secret lay in her understanding of plant biology combined with her engineering approach to environmental control. Each growing container was a masterpiece of microclimate management. Sarah had created systems that captured and concentrated available light, regulated temperature through thermal mass principles, and managed moisture levels through techniques that required no external power. She had essentially built tiny biomes that maintained Earth-like growing conditions inside spaces that could be heated with simple fire and basic materials. But the real breakthrough came when Sarah realized that her plants were actually improving the local environment. The photosynthesis process was releasing oxygen and moisture into a shelter, making the air more breathable and comfortable. The root systems were processing organic waste and producing nutrients that could be used to expand the growing area. What had started as survival agriculture was becoming sustainable ecosystem development. Marcus, meanwhile, had achieved something that bordered on miraculous. His work with the crystalline formations had created what could only be described as a biological heating grid. By carefully introducing organic materials and creating optimal conditions for the microscopic life within the crystals, he had developed a network of heating elements that actually grew stronger over time. The process worked on principles that most galactic species had forgotten in their rush toward technological advancement. Marcus understood that biological systems could be far more efficient than mechanical ones because they evolved to optimize energy use. The microscopic organisms in the crystals were essentially living heat pumps, converting small amounts of organic material into thermal energy with an efficiency that exceeded most technological solutions. But Marcus had gone beyond simply utilizing these organisms. He had begun cultivating improved strains. Using selective pressure and environmental modification, he was encouraging the development of organisms that produced more heat, required less food, and created more stable populations. He was essentially conducting real-time evolution experiments and achieving results that would normally take thousands of years. The combination of Sarah's agricultural systems and Marcus's heating innovations created something completely unprecedented. A human settlement that was not just surviving on Crystal 9, but was actually improving the planet. Temperature readings in their areas showed gradual warming, atmospheric composition showed increased oxygen and humidity, and biological activity indicators showed exponentially growing life signs. The other trial participants were beginning to take notice. Lyrax, the Zephyrian representative, had managed to locate Sarah's settlement and made contact on the 8th day. What she found challenged everything she thought she knew about survival and civilization. "This is impossible," Lyrax stated, her energy form flickering with what her species displayed as confusion and amazement. "The environmental readings indicate that you have created a sustainable ecosystem in 8 days, using what your species classifies as primitive technology." Sarah, who was tending to her growing systems while staying comfortably warm in her expanding shelter, looked up with the kind of smile that had made humans famous throughout their own history for achieving impossible things. "It's not really primitive technology, it's appropriate technology. We use what works for the conditions we're in. But you are converting a hostile environment into a habitable one," Lyrax continued. "My species requires massive terraforming operations and decades of preparation to achieve similar results. You have done this with hand tools and biological materials." "That's the difference," Marcus said, joining the conversation as he returned from checking his heating grid. "Your species thinks of environments as things to overcome or endure. We think of them as puzzles to solve. Every environment has resources and energy flows and possibilities. You just have to understand how to work with them instead of against them." Lyrax's energy form pulsed in patterns that indicated deep thought. "Your approach requires extensive knowledge of multiple scientific disciplines: biology, chemistry, physics, engineering. How does your species maintain such broad education?" Sarah laughed, a sound that seemed strange in the harsh environment but perfectly natural in the warm, humid atmosphere of her shelter. "We don't really have a choice. On Earth, specialization can get you killed. Our ancestors had to understand everything because everything could be the difference between life and death. You need to know biology to find food, chemistry to purify water, physics to build shelter, engineering to make tools. We never lost that because our planet never let us." The implications of this conversation rippled throughout the galactic community as monitoring stations transmitted the exchange. The humans weren't succeeding, despite their primitive technology. They were succeeding because their development had never allowed them to become dependent on single solutions or specialized systems. They had remained generalists in a universe of specialists, and in the ultimate generalist challenge, that was proving to be an overwhelming advantage. The second week of the trial brought new challenges, but also new opportunities for the humans to demonstrate the power of their approach. A seismic event damaged several monitoring stations and disrupted the planned supply drops that were meant to provide minimal sustenance to trial participants during the 3rd week. For most representatives, this was a potentially catastrophic setback that would force them to survive on increasingly depleted emergency rations. For Sarah and Marcus, it was barely noticeable. Sarah's agricultural systems were producing fresh food daily, and her preservation techniques were allowing her to build surplus supplies. Marcus's heating systems were providing consistent warmth without any external fuel requirements, and his understanding of the local environment had allowed him to identify additional resources that could sustain them indefinitely. But more importantly, both humans began extending their success beyond their immediate survival needs. Sarah started developing techniques for processing local materials into useful tools and construction materials. She discovered that certain types of ice, when properly formed and treated, could be used to create durable construction components that were actually stronger than many manufactured materials. Marcus began mapping the underground thermal resources of their region and discovered that Crystal 9 had extensive geothermal activity beneath its frozen surface. Using techniques that combined geological knowledge with practical engineering, he began developing methods to access and utilize this thermal energy. The potential was enormous. Enough heat to warm substantial areas and support much larger biological systems. The collaboration between the two humans also produced innovations that neither could have achieved alone. Sarah's understanding of biological systems combined with Marcus's thermal management expertise led to the development of integrated life support systems that were elegant in their simplicity and remarkable in their effectiveness. They created closed-loop systems where waste from food production became fuel for heating elements. Heat from thermal systems supported expanded agriculture, and biological processes purified air and water, while producing useful byproducts. By the end of the second week, the human settlement on Crystal 9 had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a thriving outpost that was actively improving its environment rather than simply exploiting it. Temperature readings showed that their area was consistently warmer than the surrounding region. Atmospheric analysis showed higher oxygen levels, increased humidity, and the presence of organic compounds that indicated flourishing biological activity. The psychological impact of these achievements was as significant as the practical ones. Other trial participants began seeking out the humans not just for assistance, but for understanding. The Zarathian representative, Keth Prime, made the journey to Marcus's location specifically to study the crystalline heating systems, hoping to understand how biological enhancement could improve thermal efficiency. Your species approaches these challenges with methodologies that my people have not considered. Keth Prime resonated, its crystalline structure shifting to better absorb information about Marcus's innovations. We calculate optimal survival strategies using computational analysis. You appear to use intuitive understanding combined with experimental adaptation. Marcus nodded, checking the temperature readings of his latest heating installation. We call it learning by doing. You can calculate what should work, but sometimes what actually works is something you discover through trial and error. Our history is full of accidental discoveries that turned out to be more important than the things we were trying to discover. This suggests that your species' survival advantages come not from superior planning, but from superior adaptation during execution, Keth Prime observed. You modify your strategies based on real-time results rather than adhering to predetermined optimal approaches. Exactly, Sarah added, joining them after completing her daily harvest. Flexibility is more valuable than perfection. A plan that's 80% effective but can be adjusted based on new information is better than a plan that's 90% effective but can't be changed when conditions change. These conversations, monitored and transmitted throughout galactic space, were fundamentally altering how civilized species understood survival, adaptation, and environmental challenges. The humans were demonstrating that the most sophisticated approach wasn't necessarily the most technologically advanced one, it was the most responsive and adaptable one. As the trial entered its third week, something extraordinary was happening on Crystal 9. For the first time in the planet's recorded history, it was becoming more habitable rather than less. The human settlement was creating a pocket of life and warmth that was gradually expanding. Plants were growing where none had ever existed. Thermal systems were creating warm zones that attracted and supported indigenous life forms. Water was flowing where everything had been frozen for millennia. The humans weren't just surviving the frozen hell trial, they were transforming it, and in doing so, they were proving that the most dangerous thing in the universe wasn't the strongest predator or the most advanced technology. It was a species that could look at any environment and see not obstacles but opportunities. The third week of the trial brought an unprecedented decision from the Galactic Council. For the first time in the trial's history, they dispatched additional monitoring teams to study what was happening on Crystal 9. The humans weren't just surviving, they were fundamentally altering the planet's environmental conditions in ways that challenged every assumption about planetary habitability and species adaptation. Dr. Zara Thelshin, the Council's leading expert on extreme environment survival, arrived with a team of xenobiologists and environmental specialists aboard the research vessel Deep Analysis. What they found defied not just their expectations but their understanding of what was scientifically possible. Sarah's agricultural zone had expanded to cover nearly a square kilometre. What had started as a few containers of hardy plants had become a thriving ecosystem that was generating its own microclimate. Temperature readings within her settlement showed an average increase of 37 degrees compared to the surrounding environment. Humidity levels were approaching those found on temperate worlds. Oxygen concentrations were not only breathable for most galactic species but were actively improving. "This is theoretically impossible," Dr. Thalzin stated, reviewing her instruments for the third time. The energy requirements to create and maintain these conditions should exceed what any individual or small team could generate using available resources. Yet the thermal imaging clearly shows sustained heat generation. The atmospheric analysis confirms ongoing biological processes. and the ground-penetrating scans indicate increasing soil depth and organic content. Sarah, who was harvesting fresh vegetables that by all rights should not exist on Crystal. 9. Looked up from her work with the kind of patient expression that teachers use when explaining basic concepts to students. It's not about generating enough energy to overcome the environment. It's about redirecting energy that's already here and creating systems that amplify each other's effectiveness. She led Dr. Thels in through her settlement, explaining the interconnected systems that made it work. The agricultural containers captured and focused solar energy during the day, then released it gradually during the night. The plant processes generated heat and humidity that created favorable growing conditions for additional plants. Decomposing organic matter provided both nutrients for growing food and fuel for heating systems. Water collection and purification systems created the moisture necessary for biological processes while generating thermal mass for temperature regulation. Each system supports every other system, Sarah explained, showing how heated air from her heating areas was channeled to promote plant growth, while humidity from plant transpiration was captured to provide water for other processes. It's not about overpowering the hostile conditions. It's about creating positive feedback loops that make the environment work for you instead of against you. Marcus's achievements were equally impressive, but in a different direction. His thermal grid had expanded across several square kilometers and was actually beginning to affect the planet's local geology. The enhanced biological activity in the crystalline formations was generating enough heat to begin melting permafrost layers that had been frozen for millions of years. More remarkably, Marcus had discovered that the indigenous microorganisms could be cultivated and enhanced far beyond their natural capabilities. Through careful management of their environment and food sources, he had developed strains that produced significantly more heat while requiring less organic input. He had essentially achieved controlled evolution in a matter of weeks. The implications are staggering, explained Dr. Yethmore, the team's xenobiologist, as he studied samples from Marcus's heating systems. These organisms have been modified to achieve thermal output that exceeds their natural capabilities by orders of magnitude. The genetic analysis suggests that this enhancement is stable and inheritable, meaning that these improved strains will continue to function indefinitely. Marcus nodded, adjusting the organic feeds for his latest installations. The trick is understanding what these organisms are actually optimized for, and then creating conditions that let them express their full potential. They evolved to survive in extreme cold, which means they have incredibly efficient metabolic processes. When you give them optimal nutrition and environmental conditions, they can achieve things that seem impossible under natural circumstances. The monitoring team's report to the Galactic Council created immediate controversy throughout civilized space. The humans had not just survived the trial, they had proven that the trial itself was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about survival and environmental adaptation. Every previous trial has been a test of species' ability to endure hostile conditions, Council Prime Vel Thara announced during the emergency session that followed the team's preliminary report. The humans have demonstrated that survival is not about endurance, but about adaptation and environmental modification. They have turned Crystal 9 from a survival challenge into a colonization success. The implications rippled through galactic civilization. Species that had defined their superiority based on natural advantages and advanced technology were being forced to reconsider what actually constituted evolutionary fitness. The humans, who had been dismissed as primitive and weak, were proving that adaptability and systematic thinking could overcome almost any environmental challenge. But the most significant development came during the trial's 4th week, when other participants began seeking active collaboration with the humans. Lyrix, the Zephyrian representative, had moved her operation to the edge of Sarah's agricultural zone and was learning to integrate her energy manipulation abilities with human biological systems. Keth Prime, the Zerathian, was working with Marcus to develop hybrid heating systems that combined crystalline computing with biological enhancement. We have been thinking of survival as an individual challenge, Lyrix explained to the monitoring team. But the humans approach it as a collaborative optimization problem. They create systems that benefit not just themselves, but any organism within their operational area. This collaboration produced results that exceeded what any single species could achieve alone. Lyrix's energy manipulation abilities allowed for more precise control of environmental conditions, which enhanced plant growth rates and thermal efficiency. Keth Prime's computational capabilities enabled optimization of biological systems and resource allocation in ways that would have taken humans months to achieve through trial and error. The hybrid systems they developed together created something unprecedented, a multi-species settlement that was not just surviving on Crystal, 9, but was actively terraforming it. Temperature readings showed that their combined operational area was averaging 15 degrees above freezing, with some zones reaching temperatures that were comfortable for most galactic species without environmental suits. Thelsin's final report to the Council contained a recommendation that shocked the galactic community. The trial should be terminated not due to participant failure, but due to participant success. The humans have fundamentally altered the challenge parameters. Crystal 9 is no longer a survival trial environment. It is becoming a habitable world. The political implications were enormous. Species that had used their performance in the trial to justify their position in galactic hierarchy were discovering that their achievements paled in comparison to what the humans had accomplished. More importantly, the humans had proven that the most significant challenges facing galactic civilization, environmental degradation, resource scarcity, planetary habitability, might be solvable using approaches that most species had abandoned in favor of technological solutions. As the fourth week of the trial concluded, Sarah and Marcus were not counting days until rescue. They were planning permanent installations. Sarah had begun developing techniques for soil creation that could support much larger agricultural operations. Marcus was designing thermal systems that could warm sufficient area to support a substantial settlement. Together, they were proving that humans didn't just survive hostile environments, they transformed them into homes. The monitoring team's continuous observations had documented something unprecedented in galactic history. The systematic conversion of a Class 9 hostile environment, unsurvivable for most known species, into a Class 4 environment, habitable with minimal technological support, in less than 30 standard days. But perhaps most remarkably, the humans had done this while actually improving the planet's overall ecological health. Their modifications were sustainable, expandable, and beneficial to indigenous life forms. They had proven that colonization didn't require the destruction or domination of existing environments, but could instead involve their enhancement and optimization. They are not conquering Crystal 9, Dr. Thelsin wrote in her final analysis. They are healing it. Their approach to survival has created conditions that benefit not just their own species, but any life form that encounters their modifications. They have turned an environmental challenge into an ecological opportunity. As the trial entered its final week, the question was no longer whether the humans would survive. The question was whether the Galactic Council was prepared to acknowledge that their understanding of survival, adaptation, and species fitness had been fundamentally incomplete. Because the humans had proven that the most advanced species wasn't necessarily the strongest or the most technologically sophisticated. It was the most adaptable. And adaptability, it turned out, was a human specialty that the rest of the galaxy was only just beginning to understand. The final week of the trial began with an extraordinary announcement from the Galactic Council. For the first time in the trial's 3-century history, they were extending the observation period indefinitely and reclassifying the exercise from a survival trial to a terraforming study. The humans had not just survived Crystal 9, they had begun the process of making it livable for any species in the galaxy. Sarah's agricultural systems had evolved into something that could only be described as a functioning ecosystem. Her initial containers had been expanded into terraced growing areas that covered several acres and supported not just Earth-origin plants but hybrid species that combined terrestrial genetics with adaptations for Crystal 9's unique conditions. The result was food production that was not only sustainable but was actually improving soil quality and atmospheric composition. This exceeds theoretical maximums for biological productivity in extreme environments. Dr. Thelsin reported to the Council as she walked through Sarah's expanded agricultural zone. The energy efficiency of these growing systems approaches what we would expect from advanced hydroponic facilities, but they require no external power, no manufactured nutrients, and no environmental isolation. They are essentially open-air farming operations that function in conditions that should prohibit any biological activity. Sarah, who was teaching Lyrics and several other alien representatives how to cultivate hybrid plants adapted to their specific biological needs, smiled as she checked the nutrient levels in her latest growing beds. The secret isn't fighting the environment, it's understanding it well enough to make it work with you instead of against you. Every hostile condition here can be turned into an advantage if you approach it correctly. The techniques Sarah had developed were revolutionizing galactic understanding of agricultural science. She had proven that food production was possible in almost any environment if you understood how to create the right microenvironments and support systems. Her methods required minimal technology but extensive knowledge of biology, chemistry, and ecological relationships. Exactly the kind of broad, integrated understanding that human development had emphasized. Marcus's achievements had gone even further. His thermal grid had expanded to cover nearly 50 square kilometers and was generating enough heat to begin what could only be described as localized climate change. Permafrost was melting, exposing soil that had been frozen for millions of years. Indigenous microorganisms were thriving in the improved conditions and evolving in real time to take advantage of the new opportunities. But Marcus's most significant contribution was his work with what he called symbiotic enhancement, the development of biological systems that improved the conditions for other biological systems. His modified crystalline organisms didn't just produce heat, they created thermal gradients that encouraged the growth of other beneficial organisms, which in turn created conditions that supported even more biological activity. It's a cascade effect, Marcus explained to the team of xenobiologists who had come to study his innovations. Each improvement creates conditions that enable further improvements. The heat production melts ice, which creates water for biological processes, which creates more organisms, which produce more heat and nutrients, which support larger biological communities. Once you get the cascade started, it becomes self-sustaining and self-improving. The implications were staggering. Marcus had essentially demonstrated that terraforming didn't require massive technological interventions or centuries of gradual modification. It could be achieved through careful biological enhancement that worked with existing planetary systems rather than against them. The collaborative settlement that had developed around the human operations was unprecedented in galactic history. Representatives from 7 different species were living and working together in an environment that should have been lethal to all of them, sharing techniques and resources to create solutions that none could have achieved alone. Lyrax had learned to use her energy manipulation abilities to enhance plant growth and thermal efficiency. Keth Prime had contributed computational optimization that made biological systems more effective. Even Thrakvor, the Corvellian who had initially dismissed the humans as primitive, had returned to study their techniques and contribute his species' knowledge of mineral processing to soil improvement efforts. This is not just successful survival, Council Prime Velthara declared during what had become daily briefing sessions about developments on Crystal Adine 9. This is the emergence of a new model for interspecies cooperation and environmental adaptation. The humans have created something that benefits every participant and improves conditions for all life forms in the operational area. The broader implications were reshaping galactic politics and science. Species that had based their status on individual superiority were discovering that collaborative problem-solving could achieve results that exceeded what any single species could accomplish. The humans had proven that the most advanced approach wasn't necessarily the most technologically sophisticated one. It was the most inclusive and adaptive one. As the trial's original 30-day period ended, there was no discussion of extraction or conclusion. The settlement had become a permanent research station and the foundation for what would eventually become Crystal 9's first colony. Representatives from dozens of species were requesting permission to visit and study the techniques being developed there. Sarah stood in the center of what had once been a barren ice field and was now a thriving agricultural zone, watching beings from across the galaxy work together to plant seeds that would grow into food for species that had never shared a meal before. The air was warm and humid, filled with the sounds of running water and growing plants. Children of several species played in areas that had been deadly frozen wasteland just 5 weeks earlier. You know what the real breakthrough was? Sarah asked Marcus as they watched a group of young Zephyrians learning to tend earth tomatoes while Xerithian crystalline formations provided optimal growing heat. Teaching instead of competing?
Marcus suggested
checking the thermal readings from his latest biological installations. That's part of it, Sarah agreed. But I think the bigger breakthrough was proving that survival isn't about being strong enough to overcome challenges. It's about being smart enough to turn challenges into opportunities. Marcus nodded, watching as Keth Prime worked with a team of human engineers to design heating systems that could support agriculture on a dozen different worlds, and showing that the best solutions come from understanding that every environment, no matter how hostile, has resources and energy flows that can be redirected toward life instead of against it. Dr. Talzin's final report to the Galactic Council would become required reading at universities throughout civilized space. Her conclusions challenged fundamental assumptions about survival, adaptation, and what it meant for a species to be advanced. The humans have demonstrated that evolutionary fitness is not determined by natural advantages or technological sophistication, but by adaptability, collaborative capability, and systematic thinking, she wrote. They have proven that the most primitive species may possess the most advanced survival strategies. and that the greatest achievements come not from overpowering hostile conditions, but from understanding them well enough to transform them into beneficial ones. The Frozen Hell trial had been designed to test species' worthiness through individual survival in hostile conditions. The humans had transformed it into a demonstration of collaborative terraforming and interspecies cooperation. They had turned a test of endurance into a celebration of ingenuity. More importantly, they had proven that the most dangerous thing in the universe wasn't the strongest predator, the most advanced technology, or even the harshest environment. It was a species that could look at any situation and ask not, "How do we survive this?" but "How do we make this work for everyone?" As reports from Crystal 9 reached Earth, humanity began to understand its true role in galactic civilization. They weren't the weakest or most primitive species. They were the bridge builders, the problem solvers, the ones who could take impossible situations and make them not just possible but beneficial. The galaxy had tested humanity's worthiness and discovered something unexpected. Humans didn't just deserve a place in galactic civilization. Galactic civilization needed humans to teach it what survival really meant. It meant not just enduring impossible conditions, but making those conditions possible for everyone. It meant turning frozen hells into warm homes. It meant proving that, with enough creativity, determination, and cooperation, there was no environment too hostile to support life. There was no challenge too great to become an opportunity. The trial was over, the real work was just beginning. And across the galaxy, species that had never worked together were beginning to ask themselves a question that would reshape the future. What would humans do? The answer, as they were learning, was always the same: something impossible that somehow worked perfectly.